Bill collector knocking at the door. Baby mama yelling in my ear. Honestly, a lot is going on. Only thing is I don't really care. People wonder how I keep a smile. Tell them it's cause I don't give a. I've been in my slippers for a while. Even though my haters show me love, yeah. I just wish I'm well though. Hope you getting money. Hope you doing well, bro. Heard your sister love me. I'm in Colorado. Do not fucking add me. I've been on vacation, cause I need it badly. Hotel California, my escape. Pulling up in Mexico with New York City plates. Ayy, neighbors want a photo when I visit where I stay. Ayy, if you talking drama, get the fuck up out my face. Ayy, dodging bad vibes like skirt. Drama on my line like skirt. Left it in the cash like skirt. Get into the bag like skirt. Skirt, 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 skirt. Skirt, skirt. Skirt, 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 skirt. People really think my life is perfect. Maybe cause I'm laughing through the word. Yeah, I know the devil is a lie, but the way that I've been moving got him nervous. Mac, I hope you know you did your thing. Get your rest cause homie, you deserve it. Ocean always deeper than it seems. People only looking at the surface. Paparazzi caught me hopping out my bag. Ayy, hopping in the Uber on my way to get the bag. Ayy, used to drink a bottle every day cause I was sad. Ayy, I hit up my dad like I hope that we could pass things. Woman could not put me in my feelings. If she do not want the realest nigga, then she done whack. I don't never trip, but I bet that you would love that. I don't never trip, but I bet that you would love that. Dodging bad vibes like skirt. Drama on my line like skirt. Left it in the cash like skirt. Get into the bag like skirt. Skirt, 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 skirt. Skirt, skirt. Skirt, 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 skirt.
All right, that song's longer than I remember it being, so apologize for that. But you guys, welcome. It is Tuesday morning. I think this may be the first Note to File Live of the year. So welcome back. Hope everyone had a great break, great opportunity to unwind and maybe forget about clinical research, if ever so briefly. Dr. Fox, my
morning, Brad. How are you doing?
Co-host, thank you for being here. And let's get right to it, man. I want to welcome our guest this week, Brett from Datacubed Health. Brett, how's it going, man?
Good, Brad. Thanks I'm really excited to be on here.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad, excited to have you on. Go ahead and take a few minutes, introduce yourself. Tell us about your background and a little bit about Datacubed as well.
Excellent. So I will always start off to say I'm a recovering lawyer, but I
won't hold it against you, I promise.
No worries. I have recovering in front of there, which means that I'm careful what I say at times, but you'll get a very honest opinion and commentary out of me. But I've now been in eClinical Technologies. This is actually year 25 now. I've done a number of different technologies: patient recruitment, site portals, e-consent, site payments. And the last 4 years, I've been CEO of Datacubed Health, who's one of the leading DCT, decentralized trial providers, focused on ePro and patient engagement. And really excited to be here to hopefully give you some perspective from a solution provider. And I like to say, as we talked earlier, I find that at times I am part of the problem of the industry of how we talk about DCTs. So hopefully I can help to fix that.
Man, we all are, I think sites are oftentimes their own worst enemies and also part of the problem. I mean, that's why I wanted to do this podcast. That's why we're having a conference. That's why we do these things, because, we all want to make it better. So I appreciate you coming on and, taking time out. I know something that you've already kind of touched on that's been, maybe very hot topic is, decentralized clinical trials. I can't scroll on LinkedIn without seeing it. I've been critical of the way it's been marketed and the way it's been sort of ill-defined. I mean, as a, ePro and eCOA, vendor, certainly you must feel some of that, either, I don't know, pressure to be positioned as DCT or maybe annoyed by, the way it's being sort of thrown about with very little thought sometimes. So I guess I'm kind of curious to hear, your thoughts about, the way it's been bandied about and the way it's being marketed. Like how does that feel being from, living in that world?
Yeah, great question. And I feel at times it's like to be DCT or not to be DCT. And it depends on who you're talking to. I mean, when I think about the analyst market 6 months ago, 9 months ago, went on this tirade that DCTs were no longer valid or having all these issues and DCT providers were failing, and you wanted to separate yourself from DCT, but then you'll turn around and say, oh, here's an RFI or an RFP or a company has a group on DCTs and you want to be DCT. So it really depends on who you're talking to. But to me, it gets back to, I always like to step back and say, forget the nomenclature for a second. We'll come back to that. The real question to me is, why did we get into this idea of DCTs? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? And I've always thought of it in two real simple ideas. The first idea is we all just want to provide options to patients. And this is whether you're a sponsor, a site, a technology provider, we all just want to make a patient experience better, make it simpler, give them options so that perhaps they could do a few visits electronically or a few visits without requiring to come into the site, and make sure it's available to them regardless of where they live, what their financial situation is, race, ethnicity, religious belief, all that. You want to make it accessible to everyone. So the first thing is just forgetting the bells and whistles. How do you make that easier with the options to the patients? And the second piece of that, and this really gets into the eCOA side of it, or the patient data collection. At the end of the day, was a trial, you want to safely collect endpoints. And that's the end goal. So that's where we always try to balance ourselves and say, how do we make sure that we're safely collecting that endpoint? A colleague had a funny analogy for me recently I wanted to share. He said, if you're a surgeon, you remove a spleen and should remove the gallbladder, that's med malpractice. Well, if you're a technology provider and you need to collect patient data and you do something incorrectly, that is malpractice. You may have failed that whole study. You may have failed the sites and the patients. So let's not forget that at the end of the day, we need to collect data in appropriate, a safe manner.
So I remember.
Go ahead, Fox.
Do you remember the history of DCT? Like, if you really look back and see when we went from the term virtual trials to like DCT turned into like virtual trials 2.0. I remember first hearing about it. I was a director at a site and they were talking about these things and performing these things. And my big thing is the recovering lawyer, and you might like this, but I always tried to make the legal track that would work if we tried to add all of these different parties into the agreement with sites, sponsors, CROs, and now all these other vendors. We started doing that. Of course, we can all acknowledge COVID pretty much forced DCT on the world for completion of trials. That's when we kind of remembered it happening. I remember sitting on advisory panels with large CROs, starting to introduce DCT, what they're going to do with DCT, how they're going to do DCT. And it feels like now, looking back, the inception of DCT that we know now in the environment is very similar to what we saw happening with work from home, remote work. This is possible. It can happen. But for some reason, after the emergency is over, people are going back to their traditional ways. And it feels like that's kind of like what happened with DCT. When you saw those articles, DCT bubbles popping, that kind of a thing, it's more, people are probably looking at the normalization of our industry at post-COVID, which I think that you can agree, Brett, there's going to be a home for DCT in here. We're going to have some kind of a normalization where DCT will change how we do things in the industry as a norm, but it's probably not going to get to the point that people thought it would be. You remember the days when do DCT or fail, become a dinosaur, become extinct, or adopt DCT? I don't know if you remember those conversations that happened all over social media, but I think that we're seeing maybe a pendulum where we went all the way to one way and then it's coming back the other way. And then now we're trying to find a balance. But that's a really long way of saying, when do you first remember in our industry the discussion or at least acceptance of DCT?
It's a great question. I think you actually outlined it pretty well in terms of some of the adoption, the COVID impact. But I'm going to date back a bit. And because I remember, I think it was my first scope, 2006, 7, 8, something around that time frame, hearing, and I think it was the Pfizer who had put on that virtual study years and years ago, and great idea, and for various reasons that wasn't wildly successful, but it was great to actually start the conversation, and that actually put a hold on things. I think for many years the idea was, oh, virtual trials, they won't work. I would say 2015 to 17, also the DCT nomenclature started coming around a bit more, and people weren't sure. It was almost on the heels of patient centricity was the key word for a few years. You put that in your logo, that was pretty good. Then DCTs, and everyone wanted something, didn't really define it. I agree with you. I think that COVID, I'll never say COVID had any positive impacts. You can never say that, but one of the byproducts of COVID was we had to go immediately to almost a fully decentralized trial for a period of time. And in my mind, once that scaled back a bit, people realized, you know what, you actually can have, you don't have to be fully DCT. You can have components of it, and those are options. So whether it's just as simple as the idea, I mean, telemedicine, I can't tell you, for example, I think I've gone to my physical doctor once in the last several years, but I've done a number of televisits, even though my doctor is pretty close to me, just because it was convenient. And I think those types of things that the industry realized, you can give those options to patients. And DCT, so DCT has almost evolved from, very few people will think of it as a fully virtual trial or fully decentralized, but are there components? And that's why I also think that from a site perspective, initially, I thought one of the problems of the virtual trials or DCTs was this idea of having a trial without a site. I can't imagine, and I know certain people, have a lot of faith in themselves and reading, but I can't imagine going through any treatment myself and not having a site to talk to, not having that physician to talk to. That's the comfort that you need. You have to have someone to talk to, whether it's remote or not. So I think that we've come full circle. My hope is in a couple of years, no one will talk about DCT. It'll just be various options that you have in doing a study are, you know what, I don't need to go into the doctor's office for this appointment or for this lab or for this data collection, but you always have the doctor available to you.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on something I think is like super important and a little more towards the beginning, but I mean, I feel like we kind of lost the why in this, and it became, look, as much as I've said all kinds of various things, I mean, DCT components have an important and lasting part of what we do, and they should. There's no question about that at this point. But to me, it's always going to be that these components are going to be sort of the side dish or the complement, and not the what, not the main course. Probably, maybe in some cases, but more often than not, I think that's not going to be the case. I think while the why is, sort of generally honorable and a good idea, it pretty soon it just became about the what. Like how are we going to make DCT rather than how are we going to make things DCT rather than how are we going to implement them wisely where they make sense to implement them. I think that's where with anything you start to really get off the rails, because it becomes more about, sort of forcing this methodology instead of, only using it when it's appropriate. And, I don't know, you can talk about, there's probably all kinds of crazy reasons for that, including crazy valuations for these companies. People want to make a quick buck. That's fine. I get it. But I think that's, something that really rubbed me the wrong way as, somebody who's been, I don't care. I'm at the site level. I'll do whatever it takes to make this better. I don't care if it's DCT or if it's site networks or if it's mobile units. I think ultimately it's about what actually makes sense, not being married to one tool in the tool belt. So that's kind of annoyed me, I think, to some degree. But I do, if I can, I want to take at least a couple of questions here that are popping up. If you guys are watching, feel free to comment, question. We'd love to hear from you guys. And something that, Willie brings up is, and I think maybe something you've kind of touched on too in the beginning, words matter, right? And we can't necessarily, I think we have to be very precise. And it's hilarious to me that in what should be pretty precise and scientific field, we often use words that are very imprecise. I'm guilty of this all the time. I'll say eCOA, I'll say ePro. Sometimes I mean them interchangeably. Sometimes you say patient or participant or subject, or you say DCT, and you could mean literally anything. How much of a problem do you think this is in terms of, us moving forward as an industry? Do you think the fact that we can't agree on basic stuff sometimes, does that create friction?
It probably creates confusion. So I completely agree with Willie. And I say this as someone who is the CEO of an eCOA/ePro company. So I know that I create some of the problem there. The way that I think about it, so let me use DCTs as an example. I was on a call this morning with some analysts who were talking about DCTs and measuring different providers back and forth, and their definition included things like site recruitment and patient recruitment in there. And I said, I don't know if I would agree with that, but then again, I'm not the DCT expert or the definition. We were at a DTRA conference, and they're talking about 3 different sponsors got up and talked about their definitions of DCT, and there's all nuances to them. So to me, I think that it's almost looking at the persona that you're talking to. What exactly are they looking at? If I look at a DCT RFP, there's going to be different things in there. So whether it's eCOA, ePro, DCT, I don't think that it's in our lifetime we're going to be successful at getting everyone in the industry to agree on one definition of whatever we're talking about. We talked before about patient centricity, AI. I think we've talked about Dan. We talked prior to this call, and AI has come up quite a bit. AI means everything. You can throw it. So to me, the marketing jargon is often driven by different dynamics. It could be driven by the investor market, because an investor says, I want some of that DCT, DCT is going to give you a better valuation, even though I don't know what it means. Or it could be that sponsor company has a DCT initiative or strategic initiative for there. So to me, the marketers, and I'm one of them, and I know my head of marketing she's phenomenal, and she'll always say, when should we use different terminology? But you use different terminology to meet that particular audience, and it might not be the same terminology that others use.
So I have to ask, and this has always been my big quandary. And again, Brett, this goes all the way back to the CTA, the definition of independent contractor, the definition of expectations between sponsor and site, that, the golden CTA we all follow, that site agrees to perform services per protocol for sponsor. That's about the end of the conversation there. The big question, who owns the decision to DCT in that CTA? And I say that only because I think a lot of people they're banning DCT into the EDC systems, data collection systems like EDC that's owned by the sponsor. Doug, don't kill me. I know what you're going to say. So I get that. EDC is the data collection product that results from the services of sites. That makes sense. When you go into DCT, you have that component, but you're also applying the logistics of the services that are performed contractually by the sites. So my question is, isn't the choice to perform those services via DCT technology a site choice, not necessarily a sponsor choice, regardless of who owns the money, just looking at the contract on what was agreed upon?
Brad looked like he was going to jump in. So I was going to wait.
I was saying, yeah, and look, you know, from my perspective as a site, I mean, it's a complicated question. I think it's more complicated than maybe it needs to be, but because it depends. You know, I mean, as a site, I don't want to necessarily provide ePro, right? If that's, we're considering that under the umbrella of decentralized, it's able to collect data from not the site. Happy to have that provided by the sponsor. Now you get into the logistics of like seeing a patient and utilizing things like telehealth or contracting with a lab or a mobile unit or something like that. Like, who gets to decide that? It looks to me, and again, right, wrong, or indifferent, but if you read the FDA guidance that's been drafted, the proposed FDA guidance, it seems to put the onus on the sponsor to include that in their protocol, and doesn't seem to leave a lot of space if it's not called out specifically in the protocol, which seems to give sites very little leeway in determining that, unless you start to get semantic with some of the, you know, get into the semantics with some of the definitions of these things, which we know is happening as well.
So I think if we point to the guidance, Brad, you're absolutely right. It points to the IRB because it's the ability to define DCT capable visits in a protocol. But if you go to the next line, it's the discretion of utilizing those components are at the PI. It's the PI's choice to use that stuff. It's not a sponsor's choice on who to procure. It is definitely still on the PI.
I think this will be an interesting thing over the next few years because, you know, if I'm being offered a home health nursing company, and look, we all talk, we all know, we all hear things about companies, and I'm like, you know what, these guys don't have a great reputation. I've heard, you know, things happening when they go into people's houses. I don't want to use them, but I'm a site, like I have my own nurses, or I contract with a home health company locally and I've got them, I can train them. Like, I don't know why that wouldn't be perfectly reasonable option. I'm not really seeing that happen practically in the real world, but I don't know why those kinds of things couldn't happen going forward. So I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but certainly happy to hear Brett's opinion too on kind of how that strikes out.
Yeah, so I'm going to say you're both right. And this is, I don't want to cop out on this one, but to me, so there's the sponsor certainly has to have components in the protocol that, you know, you can collect data through ePro, you can use telemedicine. There's certain things the sponsor has to have to own that, so that the protocol allows for certain elements when it relates to really the primary data endpoints. You know, nuances of there, they don't need to put in how you're going to pay the patients or things like that. That's separate. To me, though, it still always goes back to the site decision. The site is the one that's interacting with the patient. So if this, and we've had many instances for my company today and my past life for probably 10 years now, I've had various e-consent solutions in my company's current company and prior company's bag. And many times the sponsor said, we're using this e-consent, but this site doesn't want to use e-consent, or this site has their own e-consent, and it's fine. That's okay as long as that's permitted. That's really the consent is something between the site and the patient, and it's the responsibility of the providers out there to make it easy so that they can be consolidated in one system or in one data set. But at the end of the day, if I'm a site, I would say this is the consent solution I want to use. Now, obviously, you know, you might say, I want to use this other way to collect data, or I don't want to use this modality. And the sponsor might say, well, we're calling, then you can't do this study. That's a choice there. But ultimately, then it's a site's patient. And the same way that we want to give the patient some options, if they can give them options, You want to give the site some options because every site is not going to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard, right? And like Mitchell, I can in many ways support what you're saying here, right? That it should come down to the subject participant, not necessarily the sponsor or site, and we can all adapt to meet subject's needs. I agree with that broadly, but I also that's incredibly much more difficult in practice than in theory. And there's obviously got to be limits to that, right? Because they can't be like, I want to have Bob draw my blood. Well, they're not a part of the study. It's not a central lab. Well, there's going to be limits to some of this stuff, right? Because we're still, at the end of the day, conducting controlled science experiments. This isn't a consumer, being in a clinical trial is not a consumer product. Now, not that we can't, position them more that way and make them more appealing, I guess, and convenient for patients. We should do that. There's no question about it. But that's where I get confused sometimes too, where I'm like, well, again, this is a literally science experiment. Like, everybody can't do anything they want at any given time. There's got to be some limits, and maybe we have to accept that that's a limitation of patient centricity, quote unquote, because how much can we do realistically?
Yeah, and I think, Brad, it's literally a meeting of the minds. So if someone presents a problem, depending on the experience and specialty of the minds in the room, people are going to think in different ways. If someone talks about DCT like this, okay, so prime example, Brett, you're going to love this one. Okay, my site had to use a DCT component, right? And so this DCT third-party vendor came in and did something. And just like you had mentioned in the beginning, they essentially performed what you would call the malpractice, right? They messed up really bad. Guess who had to eat the deviation? It was the site.
Site, yeah.
Guess who had to be responsible for filing that deviation with the IRB? Guess who had to be signing that off? Guess who had to explain it at the audit? Was the site. It was not the third-party vendor. So when we talk about this in a room of DCTs, and you have a regulatory specialist, you have an admin contract legal specialist, and then you have a patient advocate. Of course, the patient advocate is going to say patient first, no matter what. We should all have kumbaya world, come together, wrap around the patient. The regulatory person is going to say, well, how in the world am I going to file this with the IRB? What's going to happen if I have an FDA audit? All of this other stuff. The admin person is going to say, how am I going to link this contractually in a contract? How am I going to, if something happens, who gets sued? And how am I going to pay for it? So you have all of these different minds coming together, trying to solve different problems for the same objective.
Yeah.
So it goes back to, and I see a lot of comments. Doug came back and Doug said what he always says, and he's awesome. But again, who eats the deviation? Who should be in charge of that decision to utilize DCT? And just like what Brett said, the only decision a sponsor has to make, the only one decision that a sponsor is legally entitled to is, can I work with this site? Everything else for logistics of services provided is legally the responsibility of the site.
So I agree with you that I think that at the end of the day, the site has to be the entity that has the final choice. And now the final choice, the sponsor again might say, this is what we're using. And the site might say no, and say, okay, that's not great for the study. But and I want to touch upon that. I think Doug had a great question there that I think goes a little beyond consent. So the question is, what if different e-consent solutions or methods might influence compliance? I would step back from there and say, forget about E for a second. Just think of a regular consent form. And study coordinator A and study coordinator B are going to have a very different conversation that could have a very drastic difference. So there's no difference there. As long as the consent or the telemedicine or the ePro or whatever the solution is going to be, as long as that is appropriate for the study, and the data can be standardized at the end of the day. And that's when you talk about data collection, you have to data standardized. Consent's much easier. If you might have a study that every site uses their own methodology to take consent, whether it's offline, online, different. They could each use their own e-consent solution as long as the consent forms are approved. Now it's up to all of us to monitor that and understand, does one consent methodology improve compliance or retention or experience than another, and maybe you move towards that, as long as it's not, you want to make sure, obviously you need to make sure it's not inappropriate influencing, and that's where the IRBs and IACs will step in and say, yeah, you can't have a consent solution, say we're going to give you $1,000 if you do this correctly, and influence certainly. But I would, so Doug's question, I would raise that no different for E or not E, but at this, I'd plug in telemedicine there and say, does a good telemedicine experience of one solution versus another improve compliance? Does a good study coordinator improve compliance?
I love that.
Yeah.
So Brett, that's so cool, because everyone's talking about, we've got to standardize this. Everyone's got to do it the same exact way. It's like, you've literally collected a series of independent contractors, all totally different organizations coming together, and you're expecting them to follow the same exact rules when they all have different stories and needs. And I love that. So why are we putting scrutiny under all of these E things when the same exact variability is occurring now? And it's only to be expected because, one, we're all human, and two, this is not one ring to rule all. There's a reason for that. We do that for compliance and for a lot of ethical things.
Yeah. And I think that's what Willie's point is there in terms of the content and form factor, that as long as you have the approved content, the method of the process there, or how we're communicating, that's always going to, that may differ very naturally culturally, may differ within a site. You might have a different conversation with one patient versus another patient because of the patient. But as long as it's all appropriate and isn't influencing them inappropriately one way or another, then I think you have to have those options out there.
But ultimately you're right. And we've seen it. Everyone's seen it. We got two coordinators. They both consent patients. So one seems to have a much higher, conversion rate and have better compliance than another coordinator, because they're not doing things exactly the same way. There's a certain level of variation there. And ultimately that's not a bad thing for sites. If most sites have access to the same basic tools, and some are significantly more successful than others. That's because they have some room to do things a little bit differently. So no, that's interesting. And I'm going to pick up on, Alexandria's comment too, that using sponsor provided tech,
again, this
source meets internal, SOPs.
Yep.
So that's interesting because, it is, if you've got a outside vendor doing what's ostensibly the site's job, or the reason for the site existing, right? What sites normally do, those things may conflict, and you're creating, possibly creating bigger issues. I don't know. That's interesting. And maybe a question for you, Brett, too. Like, is there a world in which sites choose their ePro vendor that they work with? Is there, a generic, like, okay, we have to collect, these data points, but I hate this ePro vendor, but we like to work with this ePro vendor. Is there any world in which sites could have some influence on doing that?
So I would say yes and no. I think we should reach a world that way. I want to be real about the complexities there. And I think Willie had a comment there earlier in terms of the standards. The complexity of having multiple solutions is, how do you standardize everything? And if every protocol was written and there was no such thing as a protocol amendment, then that may be more feasible. But the reality of having multiple vendors of different systems and having to change each time, that may make it more difficult. And something like an ePro, where you're dealing with different data collection. Now, might it be easier with telemedicine? Probably. With e-consent, certainly. I think e-consent, I've seen it work many times, where you can use many different solutions if you need to, paper being one of them, obviously. You can get there with ePro, and the more simpler ones, it just becomes, there's a level of complexity of having, and from a sponsor perspective, they also don't want to be going through and making sure 3 or 4 different ePros are validated there. Now, that said, whatever whatever solution you're using, you still want to have some options. So, for example, the patient might want to use their own device. They may want to use another device. They might want to use a computer. They might want to have the option, if everything fails, how can they use some kind of a paper form for that if they have that? So you want to have some options there, which technically it can be different solution providers. It's just a little more complex depending on the complexity of the study.
So Brett, we talked a lot about the maybe miscommunications of DCT among all the parties. Maybe people have different expectations of what it can do for them or even what they can do with it. How would you market DCT so that it could be readily adoptable as an industry standard across sites, sponsors, everyone? So how can we market it so that it can be an adoptable technology to enhance what we do?
So I'm going to go back for 1 second to that question, because when I think about how to market it, I think about how we've messed things up marketing in the past. And I think I mentioned the term patient centricity before. To me, every couple of years, there are buzzwords in the industry that every vendor and every sponsor, everyone needs to they jump onto. It was patient centricity for years. If you had that, you had everything. RWD, RWE, that became the buzzword, and all these terms had multiple meanings to it. DCT. Right now, the last couple of years, we all talk about diversity. We all talk about AI. I think I mentioned earlier, my next company will be diversityai.com, and investor will give me money. I have no idea what we'll do, but you throw the buzzwords together.
You figure it out later.
Yeah, did you see that one from Doug? The post Doug did about the next big thing. It was really funny.
Yes.
Future.
Yes,
There's your company right there.
List of everything. So to me, it's less about how do we market DCT. It's more about let's talk about what the end goal is. How do we market options for patients and for sites to make the trial easier to do? So how do we? So what I would say is, to some extent, we want to get away from the buzzwords. We're going to say, so when I'm going to walk around Scope in a month, and I'm going to walk around most booths, and most booths are going to be, similar. Probably, I don't. Our booth may have similar buzzwords in there. You want to have them, people can pick up on them. But I like to walk around and understand. Oh, this company, you're providing a solution to pay sites. Got it. This company, you're providing this. So to me, it is the idea of optionality. How do we market that we're giving safe options to patients and sites? I mean by safe is both safe from a patient safety perspective, but also a regulatory perspective. We don't want to have bells and whistles out there because they're cool bells and whistles and they look sexy on a slideshow or sexy on a demo, but we forget the fact that may only work in a rare circumstance, or that will work in one country and not other countries. So we want to give them options. To me, I like to use the term optionality. And optionality is not just patient optionality, it's site optionality and CRO optionality and sponsor optionality, to say every patient's not the same, every site's not the same. How do we just give them a few options to make the study easier without creating too much complexity of having that sort of pick your Chinese menu of which solutions you're going to have of you don't want to get that complex.
So a few things sparked my mind when it happened there. And Brad, if you'd be willing to put that comment up from Willie about sites just walking away from projects. That is exactly it. So Willie, you are spot on. We are in an economy where you literally vote with your dollar. And it's not just sponsors, but it's also sites. So there's going to be a future where sites are going to include their tech stacks into their feasibilities, and sponsors will select sites based off of their feasibilities. That's going to be what happens. It's going to be site to sponsor, not sponsor to site. And Willie, what's going to end up happening is when those standards are applied at the site level, sponsors aren't going to find the sites that meet what the sponsors want. It's going to be sponsors adapting their protocols around the environments that the trials are being performed.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think it's the right point. I think it's also the right way we should go. Now, the only thing we're going to be careful about is we don't want to dissuade sites from participating in trials. I mean, we all know that there's not enough sites. There's many physicians out there that are just scared because of all these, everything we talked about today. The flip side is it creates complexities that many physicians say, I don't want any part of this. This is too complex for me. So that's the only thing that I always want to be careful about is we don't create a situation that there's only fewer and fewer sites are doing that, and only the ones that will agree whatever the sponsors want. To me, there's a natural friction we need. We need sites to push back at time to say, you know what, that solution's not going to give my patient any benefit. I use the example, and apologies to my team to some extent, telemedicine. In our solution, we have telemedicine available. People use it sometimes. I'll look at and say in my doctor's offices, they use, I forget which platform they're using for their telemedicine for day-to-day visits. And if they're running studies, they might say, I want to use the same platform. I'm using this, or I'm scheduling using this one platform. We want to make sure that we're not just increasing burden on the sites over and over again because of a new technology or what we're calling an end-to-end solution, when the reality is the site might already have their own consent process. The site might already have their own telemedicine process. They just say, actually, all I need here is an ePro component, or all I need here is a wearable.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I get sponsors' inclination to sort of like provide everything, because to your point, again, presumably they're creating a situation where anyone can participate in a trial. You don't have to have all this complex technology. We're bringing it to you. Here it is. Great. But I think unfortunately, it sort of becomes like least common denominator for everybody. That's now sort of forced, even if you've got your own solutions, to your point, Brett, which that's where I'd love to see is the option for the site to opt out and work with their own service provider, depending on what that thing may be. And again, I realize not everything will be choosable, so to speak. Again, I don't know why, if we had data standards, why I couldn't be like, you know what, I like Datacubed, so I want to use them as my ePro. The data is going to all get reported back to you in the same format, so who cares, right? And again, I know that's maybe more complex than I'm making it, but telehealth's a perfect example, or e-consent, which we talked about, another perfect example. Like, nah, man, I've got e-consent. It's the same damn thing. Don't make me use something else that I don't like, we're not comfortable with. And we just don't really, I think that's the exception right now. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been turned down for e-consent, period, when I try to bring it to the table. It's very, it's very saddening, unfortunately.
And think about the maturity of site networks as they start to go ISO compliant with vendor approval systems. There's going to become a time where the vendors have to be vetted by the sites, because it's the sites that are liable for what the vendors do. So Brett and Brad, my recommendations for any site listening to this who are interested in DCT, actually there's two. So number one is, if you don't yet have an SOP for DCT in your community, specific to your site, on how you would actually perform DCT in your community with your network, that's probably the number one thing you really ought to get in for 2024, is get that DCT SOP in place so that you are capable of doing things like this. So Brett, when you work with sites, do you have some kind of a template that sites can ask you for to get DCT implemented as an SOP? Anything to help them?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'll tell you that from a vendor perspective, it's always been this big debate with vendors. Is you're selling to the sponsors and CROs? So they're the buyers typically. The end users are often the sites and the patients, and obviously patient. So how much do you promote and push through the sites to get site adoption? You know, if you get the sites excited, will they come, and will the sites move that forward? The difficulty as a vendor, to be honest, is there's so many sites out there and so many different site networks. It's not like, you've got two sites that are handling 90% of the market. So there's so many sites out there, and how strong of an opinion or how strong a word will the sites have for the sponsors and the technology they want. So we will always engage with sites in two manners. So first, on a study perspective, it's going to be in training and options, and that's basic. But we'll engage with sites offline, sometimes in an official capacity, like an advisory board, and sometimes it's just for ad hoc feedback to make sure that we're getting that. And most vendors have the same concept, whether they say, I'm going to join an association and put a logo up there, and that's how I talk to sites, or I talk to sites, or even in my last company, what we did is we hired, our whole service team was from sites, so we had an on the ground understanding there. I'll tell you that. So to answer your question, do we have something for sites for SOPs? Not necessarily. It's an interesting thought that we can put together. We always want to get site feedback and site participation and site input into the solution, because the last thing that any provider wants to do is say, we're going to reduce the patient burden and add to the site burden. That's actually, that's worse than just not even offering it at all. You don't want to add to that burden, because that's, at the end of the day, the site is and should have a strong voice with the sponsor on what they're going to use. So I think that forums like this, and the way that the sites can better network together and speak up with the sponsors, that's just going to force the industry to create solutions with the site in mind. I'm not sure if I answered the question there or walked around it, but.
Yeah, and I think ePro is a tough one, because there's not a lot of you're not selling to sites ever, really, at least not in this, way we're set up now.
Yeah.
And I've seen more ePro vendors get out talking to sites like you're describing, which I think is smart. And I still think like the voice of the site, you're like, hey man, we all hate working with this company, but we all love working with this company. I mean, I think that's going to make some waves over time. So, but yeah, to your point, it is kind of tough, because I can't think of any instance in which, a site's going to be your direct customer per se. It'll always be a user, but I think that puts those types of vendors in sort of an awkward situation, because I mean, I get it. I can understand and sympathize with the fact that look, you want to sell sponsors, right? Now I think there's a lot of value in being the most liked, vendor from sites, but at the end of the day, you're probably going to work on appealing more to the sponsor side than the site side.
Yeah. I mean, from a selling perspective, marketing, yeah, of course I want to be the most liked, and sites love it. The reality is, I don't want sites to even know about me. I want to be in the background, that sites say, oh yeah, it just works. So remember there was the old BASF commercials. No one knew what they did. It just worked. And I want, because when we hit that point, that means that the patients are getting the benefit, the sponsor, the site, we're just removing a burden from the site. The sites don't need to get training on systems and input systems, but we're just taking something away. The site doesn't need to worry about that. That is the nirvana.
That would be ideal. That would be ideal, because I mean, most ePro systems are fairly, at least in the beginning, time intensive on the site staff to get set up and going. And you think about things like IRT may be a good example of I've got a hard time thinking. I can't think of a lot of terrible IRT systems, or IVRS, or whatever you want to call them. IXRS, I guess, if you want to be a little more modern. But ePro is always going to have some front end touch, from the site. So yeah, the less I know, the less I think about you, the better is probably accurate.
Yeah, exactly.
So Brett, there's a lot of enterprise level site networks now that are even bigger than some of the CROs. Are you targeting any of them for a standardized solution? Are you selling to sites yet?
So yeah, so some of the larger, those larger networks that are building up, some of them have technology in their remit to try to standardize on some. So yeah, we are definitely in discussions or beyond discussions, and with certain, so that they could use our solution if they are the only or they are the majority of the sites in a certain study, then they'll have a louder voice and they can use it. That's something that they can use for, and like others where they can use, there's a freebie that they can use for some smaller individual things. You could have that. But I think to Brad's point, our main goal with sites is to be in the background, to minimize, have as less of a touch point with a site as possible, so that we don't become something else. What I want to avoid is, and Brad, I saw recently the tech stack, the building of the devices. We don't want to be one of those devices in there, in that tech stack. We want to be something that promote, that the patients will help it will help the patients, and the site will get some reporting with it, but that's about it. There's a very low touch point. But with those larger ones, yeah, where they want some tech solutions, we're certainly involved in those discussions. Yeah. Let me ask one question of both of you, if you don't mind.
Please.
Because we talked earlier about site feedback, and like I said, we've done it different ways. Like others, we'll put different logos up and say we're part of this organization, that organization, and have the voice of sites. But the reality is, where we get the best feedback is from hands-on site users. As sites, I mean, how do you look at it in terms of vendors approaching you or your team to say, can you give us feedback outside of a trial? You're busy enough, and is that an annoyance or is that a welcome request?
No, I love it. And we've had we've had one come out recently, a fairly big ePro and more vendor. And I have another one coming out next week, and they're doing exactly that. They know that, we interact with their stuff a lot. They have a team coming out and just sort of talking, not just to me, but talk to the coordinators who use it even more than I do at this point. I think it's great. I will never turn down a company who's asking to do that. Now, sometimes it's more inconvenient than others, but I'll always try to make ourselves available to do that. I think even the staff gets, insight from it, and asking the questions and being like, oh, okay, well, this makes sense as to why this works this way, and vice versa. They learn like, oh, you guys are using this differently, than we thought, or this is more of a pain in the ass than we thought it was. We didn't realize that. So again, I will always take those opportunities as a site, and even as a relatively small and insanely busy site, we'll make the time. I think it's important, that sites do that. We can't just complain. We have to contribute and help be a part of that process. So I love it. I'd say do it as much as you can. If you can take a day and fly out to a site that uses your stuff a lot, I think you'll probably walk away learning way more than you expected to, and you probably have in the past. But I think it's underutilized and undervalued as well.
So reading the latest comment.
I don't know if Fox is frozen or very intent. Okay, he must have frozen.
Yes,
I was like, man, he's really locked into whatever he's looking at there. There you are. You're back.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
I thought you were. Yeah, I thought you were just super focused, but I think you were frozen. Yeah, you were just like.
Did you want my answer now?
That'd be excellent.
I hope you weren't waiting for me. I do apologize.
No, go ahead.
I call it country internet. Someday when I'm big and rich, I'll get like that satellite internet or something that won't go out. So I see it both ways. A lot of the sites that we talk to, they say, thank you so much for listening to us. We really appreciate having a voice. We really appreciate having a contribution into the ecosystem to make things better. That way we won't see this on the next trial. That's one. That's phase one. Yeah. The other way it could go is we feel like you're using us to make money and we're not getting anything out of it. So it all depends on the type of site you work with and how you present it to them. If you make it feel like you're literally extracting their ideas and then making money off of it and then leaving them in the dust, they're going to be kind of resentful. If you're very appreciative about it, and you say, thank you so much, we want to do this to make your life better, and you truly communicate that relationship, not a relationship of transaction and take, but a relationship of community, then they're very appreciative. So I think it's all about the delivery. I think it's a good thing to do, but you have to do it right.
Yeah, bring me lunch, man. At least bring us lunch, you know.
At least buy me dinner before, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, it's funny because you actually, the behavioral scientists on my team would have loved that answer, because I said it's not about, there's obviously, we'll joke about, you come in, I'll get requests, for my time for different things too. And it's like, do I want to come, lunch, drinks, and there's things that we joke about, or like, yeah, it's nice to have that, or you throw me a Yeti once in a while. But the reality is, it's, our time, we want to get some value out of it. So I agree with you. Like when I look at it from my time, when I get asked to do different types of market research response there, like I want some insights out of there. I don't want the Amazon gift card or the lunch or this. I want to make sure that I'm getting something of value that I wouldn't have otherwise had. So I think that you're right, that if how do we make sure that your voice is heard and it's important, and we'll bring that feedback back, and you're getting something out of it as a site, not just thank you, now I can go sell more of my widget.
Yeah, or I just made $1 million and gave you a $25 Amazon gift card. So we have to get away from the transactional, and we have to treat it like an ecosystem, like we're all contributing and we're all benefiting. It's equal benefit, equal contribution, so they're all helping each other.
Yeah.
So
no, I couldn't agree more. We're getting down to the last couple of minutes here. So say, Brett, got any final words or final thoughts, and also maybe tell people where they can find you online, how people might be able to reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, Brad and Daniel, thank you very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I could probably go on for hours, and hopefully we'll grab some pints someday at a pub.
I'll be at Scope.
Oh, excellent. I will meet you there in person then.
All right.
So to me, the final thoughts is, at the end of the day, think back to DCTs. Forget about the logos and keywords and buzzwords and all that. Just think about, how do you provide options for your patients and sites, and how do you make sure that you collect patient data safely? If you stick with those two things, you'll be fine, and avoid all the buzzwords and big speakers. Just stick with that. If you want to reach out to me, I am I'm very much a LinkedIn responder. So connect with me on LinkedIn. You're not going to see a lot of posts. I read Brad's all the time. Really enjoyed them. I think, Brad, I have to say that your posts are often what's in my mind, but I won't want to say. So I appreciate that. But LinkedIn, or you can reach me at Datacubed, brett.kleger@datacubed.com. So thanks again for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Dr. Fox, any final thoughts?
I think the one thing to note is, this is not sites versus DCT. Sites don't hate DCT at all. In fact, sites see a lot of value in helping their patients for DCT. I think what sites hate is choices that they are legally obligated to make and they are liable for, that are being made by other people who do not take responsibility for the outcomes. So again, this isn't DCT versus sites. This isn't, we are all fighting for competition for way too much work that not everyone can do. It's just a matter of understanding where we all come from and the expectations that we all have.
Very good. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys, for watching. Thanks for your comments, and probably see you next week. Thanks, guys.